Hi, I'm Gars, and I'm presenting a project in which we conducted a field experiment with online journalists in Kenya to investigate the effects of performance pay on writers and the content of the news. So the motivation for this project is that performance contracts are increasingly used for freelancers, including in digital media, though in the area of clickbait and increased political polarization, critics have raised concerns about its impact on journalistic welfare and media quality. And currently, there's no evidence at the individual level of how incentives affect the production of news content. So in designing performance contracts, when objective measures of performance are available, such as the number of views an article gets, generally average effort is best incentivized by paying a peer commission. Theoretically, this can have a number of potentially adverse effects, including imposing all the risk on writers, leading to declines in the quantity of articles produced, and perhaps change a number of aspects of the content, including the topics that writers choose, overall sentiment, and the use of clickbait. This is potentially problematic, as previous literature has shown that media content and information quality can influence a range of beliefs and behaviors, including voting, and that the rise of political polarization is due in part to the language of the media. So to give you some background on the firm, this is an online local newspaper that sources stories from citizen journalists who have full discretion over all aspects of the articles, including the number, quality, and the topics of the articles submitted, and each article goes through an editorial process that screens for hate speech and plagiarism. Once the article goes through this process, it's then published on the website. So at the time of the experiment, they averaged about 1.5 million monthly readers. They published over 800 articles weekly, and these articles were produced by about 60 writers per week on average. So this experiment took place on the firm's digital platform for 6 months starting in August 2017, in which writers were randomized into one of three groups. The first is the status quo contract of $1 per published article. Second is a pay-per-view contract in which the writers were paid based on a piecewise linear fee structure that was a function of the number of unique views that the article generated. And then a second treatment arm in which writers were actually able to choose their contract. So because the experiment took place on a digital platform, we have the full history of articles and writers, which we then combine with Google Analytics to have a measure of the number of unique views per article. Further, at the time of submission, each article was judged by editors on its quality, and writers self-reported their effort at the time of the article submission on the platform. Finally, we use a number of machine learning and natural language processing techniques to construct measures of clickbait, readability, informativeness, and the sentiment of the text. So what we find is that the pay-per-view contract had an immediate and persistent impact on news content and writer behavior. The pay-per-view contract increased popularity of articles, measures the average number of views, by about 180% on average, and this effect was spread across the distribution of writers, not just the most productive. At the same time, the total number of article submissions dropped by 7 per week relative to the control, which was a decline of about half. When we analyze the results by the level of risk aversion, we find that the effects of submissions are concentrated primarily amongst the most risk-averse writers in the treatment group, suggesting that shifting the risk towards these writers has a large impact on the amount of content that is created, depending on the distribution of risk preferences amongst workers. And despite this drop in submissions, total views increased by about 120% over the length of the experiment, which directly translated into increased revenues for the firms. However, these increased revenues came at the expense of significant changes in content. Overall readability increased, but we don't find any effect that clickbait became more prevalent or that subjective quality changed at all. However, what we do see is that writers shifted away from all other topics to primarily political articles. We see an almost doubling of political articles. We see a sharp decline in the share of local news. Further, when we analyze the impact of the treatment on sentiment, particularly amongst the subset of political articles, we find that articles with positive news titles declined by over 25%, and that this crowding out of positive news led to higher overall negativity. So taken together, the results suggest that journalists had knowledge about the production function that they weren't sufficiently incentivized to use under the pay-per-article contract. However, when these output-based pay was introduced, we show that average views increased significantly, but that risk-averse writers are made worse off, and that these incentive contracts have important implications for the quality and content of the news, with short and long-term implications for firm profitability and reputation, as well as the immediate environment.